No worries. Hello,
Hi,
Prof. Las.
hi, Heidi.
Hi there. Sorry, just my last meeting ran over a bit.
Hello, Prof. Charles.
Hi, Tian.
How are you doing?
Good. And you?
I'm good, thanks. Okay, great. I think we can start. Okay, so it is the top of the hour. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this COP Live webinar on vaccine confidence, the arsenal to COVID-19 vaccine uptake. This webinar is brought to you by WITS, RHI, and AVAC with support from PEPFAR and USAID. Globally, research teams are embarking on various clinical trials focused on finding a COVID-19 vaccine. However, efforts to find a vaccine are characterized by misinformation, anti-vaccine sentiments, conspiracy theories, general distrust, or safety concerns. Growing evidence shows that these challenges lead to serious public health consequences, including vaccine hesitancy, increased public fear, and low vaccine confidence. These challenges may lead to lower vaccine acceptability when the COVID-19 vaccine becomes available. During this webinar, our speakers will unpack the determinants of vaccine hesitancy and how it can serve as a barrier to uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine. They will also share strategies that can be used by advocates and community engagement practitioners in response to misinformation and rumors in order to build and sustain vaccine confidence. Colleagues, welcome. My name is Tian Johnson, founder of the African Alliance and founding member of the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, a global group of vaccine advocates who work to ensure that vaccine research is accountable, transparent, and community-owned. Today, we speak to two thought leaders in the vaccine and public health space, Professor Heidi Larson and Professor Charles Wisonge. I will moderate the call and begin with an introduction of our two speakers, who will then each give a 5-minute overview of their current work and some high-level remarks on the state of COVID-19 vaccine confidence in the context in which they work and generally. We will then open the floor for questions and comments for the panelists to address for the remainder of the hour. To ensure we get maximum benefit from this hour, all mics will be turned off and participants are asked to enter their questions or comments in the Q&A box, and we will attempt to get to as many of them as possible during the hour. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers this afternoon, starting with Professor Heidi Larson. Professor Larson is Director of the Vaccine Confidence Project and Professor of Anthropology, Risk and Decision Science at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Clinical Professor in the Department of Health Metric Sciences at the University of Washington in the USA. Her research investigates the social and political factors that affect uptake of health interventions, with a particular focus on managing risks and rumors. Professor Larson previously headed global immunization communication for UNICEF and chaired the Gavi Advocacy Task Force. She is the principal investigator of an EU project on acceptance and compliance of Ebola vaccines in Africa, a global study on vaccine acceptance during pregnancy, and a new global study on public emotions around the COVID-19 response. She recently won a Facebook Research Award on her work on the contagion of misinformation and is the author of Stuck: How Vaccine Rumors Start and Why They Don't Go Away. Also joining us this afternoon is Professor Charles Wisonge. Charles is the Director of Cochrane South Africa at the South African Medical Research Council. He is also an extraordinary professor of global health at Stellenbosch University and an honorary professor at the School of Public Health and Family Medicine at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Charles is a member of numerous national and global advisory committees on research, evidence-based policy, and vaccination. These include chair of the Vaccine Hesitancy Working Group of the National Advisory Group on the Immunization in South Africa, member of the Logistics Workstream of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on the COVID-19 vaccine, and a member of the WHO Working Group on measuring behavioral and social drivers of COVID-19 vaccination, and vice chair of the Global Research Collaboration for Infectious Disease Preparedness. His current research focuses on vaccination uptake and hesitancy in Africa. Welcome to you both, and thank you for taking the time out today to engage with us. I'd like to start by asking you, Professor Larson, over the next 5 minutes to share some general remarks on the work that you do at the Vaccine Confidence Project, as well as some remarks on the state of the field as it relates to vaccine confidence in the context of COVID-19.
Thanks very much. I apologize about the video, but the host needs to let me open my video. Apparently, it's being blocked. Otherwise, I'll, in the meanwhile, start talking. Nice to meet all of you. As was mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and my area in particular is risk and decision science. with the context of societal and cultural implications. But most relevant to the meeting today is I founded the Vaccine Confidence Project 10 years ago, having worked the previous 10 years with UNICEF and other partners and Gavi on building confidence and trust in the introduction of new vaccines, which is when I saw a growing epidemic of questioning and small and large around particularly new vaccines, which is also relevant to the current COVID environment. The Vaccine Confidence Project is particularly interested in investigating and mapping. Oh, there we go. Great. Hello. Sorry, I'm still a bit in the dark anyway. Excuse me. To investigate and map the sources and causes of people's concerns and issues, because one of the important things we feel in the Vaccine Confidence Project is that we're not only communicating what we think is important for the public they should know, but responding to and listening to the public. And I think the framework of engage is particularly relevant in this context. So moving on to the current context, I think that on our website, www.vaccineconfidence.org, we have a lot of information on some of the learnings we've had with vaccines more broadly. We continue to map and listen about concerns and issues and innovations around vaccine uptake globally. But since the beginning of the year, since COVID was front and center, we have shifted a lot of our listening to the specifics of COVID, the COVID response. We've also thought it was very important to be listening to conversations and understanding the emotions around COVID response more broadly, particularly measures like control, masks and lockdowns and quarantine, those kind of issues, because we have learned over the decade how important broader issues of trust in government, how much they affect uptake of vaccines. If you have other issues with the government or distrust with a healthcare worker or bad experience in a healthcare setting, that can influence your willingness to take a vaccine, even if that not great experience or distrust was about something else. So it's really important to look at the whole life cycle, as it were. Around COVID vaccines in particular, this has been a very busy week, certainly for the Vaccine Confidence Project. There has been one announcement after another about some of the new learnings, some of the new findings with 3 of the many vaccine candidates. This is just the beginning of news we will be getting. And this was starting with AstraZeneca, which has what they call an mRNA vaccine, which is a brand new approach to vaccination. That was reporting a 90% efficacy, which is really quite high. And then Sputnik, the Russian vaccine, which is a different approach, which is what they call adeno. It was 92%. And then, yes, in the past couple of days, Moderna, which also has the mRNA, reported as high as 94.5% efficacy. And just to give you some context, the typical seasonal flu vaccine is more like 50 to 60%, even it can be that low. Whereas the measles vaccine is something like 98% efficacy. It's quite high. So the findings this week, the news this week has been tremendous. It's good news for COVID, but we have to be cautious because we need to manage expectations. These are not the final trial results, but each of these producers felt that they had enough indicative evidence of this efficacy that it was important to let the public know that we're on a good track here. So this is actually unusual. Usually these announcements are made when the trials are totally complete. But I think that it's important for the public to know that we're very likely to have an effective vaccine or vaccines, which is more the case. But there are challenges with the different vaccine, particularly logistics, because the mRNA vaccines require extremely cold chain requirements, which is more challenging in poorer countries, which is where the other one, the adeno, is probably more feasible. I don't want to take more time. I don't want to leave it to questions, but that's the setting. Hopeful week. Need to manage expectations, watch this space, but in the meanwhile, we shouldn't wait to engage publics around the COVID vaccine and the differences in the vaccines and what's going to be needed, the difference, why have some one dose, some two. All of these things should already be discussed with communities before we have the vaccine in and ready to go. Thanks so much. And I really look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Prof. Larson. I think what particularly stood out to me as you were speaking is the issue of looking at vaccine results and how we communicate around vaccine results in that broader picture, whether it's what's happening nationally or in the context of geopolitical issues. So that's certainly something to pique our participants' interest as we move ahead. So thank you for that. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Wisonge to share your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you so much. It is for the organizers for inviting me, and thank you for the kind introduction. It is an honor to share this stage with Heidi Larson, who undoubtedly is the most authoritative voice on vaccine confidence. You know, here I work for the South African Medical Research Council, where most of our work is around synthesizing existing evidence. And our work around vaccination is synthesizing evidence around uptake of vaccinations, interventions that could improve vaccination uptake, and also around vaccine hesitancy. And as we look ahead to when the COVID vaccine would be widely available, it's good to look backwards. And the COVID-19 pandemic reminds me of the pre-vaccine outbreaks of very dreadful diseases. It is easy to forget that diseases like smallpox, polio, and yellow fever used to cause death and disability among millions of people in areas of the world that are now free of these diseases, thanks to vaccination. Just at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, back in April 2020, there were some derogatory remarks that were made by two French doctors about testing COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. And these comments were rarely accompanied by a torrent of anger in Africa, expressed through social media and beyond. A few months later, when the first COVID-19 vaccine trial started here in South Africa, we saw protests, and some of the protesters carried some of the banners with the same kind of messages that we saw on social media after these derogatory remarks by French doctors. And as Professor Larson just talked about the news this week about information already about 3 of the vaccines that are already shows a lot of promise, very effective, but we are still going to look at the data when it becomes available. But as development of these vaccines progress, there have been various surveys to find out if people would take these vaccines when they become available. Around July, August 2020, one of these surveys was done, which interviewed about 20,000 people in many countries around the world, including in South Africa. And what we see from the results is that only 2 out of 3 South Africans interviewed intend to take the COVID-19 vaccine when once become available in the country. And various reasons were given for why these people would refuse the vaccine. Some of them said that they would not have the time to go for vaccination. Some of them did not think that they were sufficiently at risk to want to take a COVID-19 vaccine. Some people thought that the vaccine would not be effective. And as we have just seen, the vaccines, the evidence that is coming out now is telling us that this is going to be about 90% effective, which is as effective as one can go quite effective. But most people were also worried about the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine. So the World Health Organization refers to this refusal or delay in the acceptance of vaccines as vaccine hesitancy, despite the availability of vaccines as vaccine hesitancy. And this is not a new phenomenon, but we have seen that social media has pushed it to a very high level. There is a lot of misinformation and disinformation about COVID-19 vaccines on social media. And countering such disinformation will require activation of communication tools that engage people in the format and language that they want to hear. There is a need for emotion-based communication focused on counter narratives. And as Tian and Heidi already said, vaccine hesitancy poses significant risk not only to the hesitant people, but also to the wider community. When COVID-19 vaccination will become widely available, if there are refusals or delays to take this vaccination, this would put communities at risk and will not be able to reach coverage levels that would reach what we call herd immunity. And if that is the case, it would perpetuate community transmission of COVID-19 and it would keep the pandemic alive. And this is not what we would like to have. But of course, now the issue is about access, but we need to start preparing now so that when we eventually have the vaccines widely available, people who need them should really take them. And I thank you, Tian and Heidi.
Thank you so much, Prof. Some really interesting insights, and I appreciate the fact that you had given that historical context around how hesitancy and even denialism is really built upon a historical context that we saw with the French doctors, at least in the context of COVID. So I think without further ado, we can get straight into questions. We have quite a few that have already come through. The first one from Jessica is, and this will be directed to Prof. Larson. In my own family, I hear people talking about how they aren't going to take the first vaccine because they aren't sure it's safe. Even though the announcements of Pfizer and Moderna are extremely promising, I'm nervous that the timing between this announcement and the availability of a vaccine will heighten their hesitation. What are some of the effective messages we can use with people who aren't public health professionals?
Well, I think that we should certainly be assuring people that these vaccines have gone through all the same rigorous safety controls that all vaccines do. The process from the lab to when people actually, the discovery in the lab to when people actually get vaccines has many, many steps. But the steps related to the safety and the efficacy measures have not been changed at all. In fact, they've been extra rigorous, as they are generally with new vaccines. There are other parts of that timeline that have been shortened. One, we had a funding mechanism, CEPI, which we never had before, but thanks to Ebola, the global health community and scientific community realized there was no funding mechanism for an emergency where trials need to start quickly. So there was this fund established. So we were able to fund and get trials started much quicker than usual. The other thing that's happened is we have a lot of new technologies, a lot of new possibilities that make the processes that we're using for some of these vaccines newer, more efficient. We can produce more quantity than in older vaccines. So that's good news. So I think that the most important thing that people are assured that all processes around safety are really strongly prioritized and considered. And the industries themselves have stood up and signed a joint statement saying we will not be pushed by any political process to skip any safety steps.
Thanks for that. I think almost tied into your opening remarks, Prof. Larson, Adele is asking, you have linked vaccine confidence to trust in governments. How do you improve trust in government health systems? And of course, the really big, broad question, it's almost asking, how do we solve inequality or poverty? But in that context of vaccine research, how do you almost in tandem build that confidence in government and health systems? So I guess it really relates to governance. What are your thoughts on that?
It is related to governance, but I think these are situations where, particularly when the distrust is in central government, it's really, and I think, which is the case in many countries, that right now, that we really need local engagement. Governments at many different levels, health systems are at many different levels. The more we can engage locally at the level of mayors or community leaders, local hospitals, even religious leaders, I think people are very, there's a lot of anxiety in general, but the controls mostly are coming from central government, and they're well-intentioned with public health motives, but not always trusted. And also there's the global environment. This is there's a lot of global guidance and, you can't really do requirements globally, but there's a lot of statements and coming globally. And there are, particularly for minorities and groups that are typically marginalized, there's not a lot of trust in systems that don't take care of them. So I think one way to build trust also is in this time of COVID, where people are having a lot of challenges with health more broadly, because there's been this really terrible knock-on effect on other access to health issues because of COVID, distancing from health clinics, just our health workforce has been very focused on COVID. So the more we can rebuild that trust by taking care of some of their other health needs and send this message that we care about your overall well-being. This isn't just to get, as they say, a jab or a shot in your arm and, check that off. Because when I've sat with communities, sometimes they say when it comes to vaccination or immunization, we feel like a number. And we can't, this is not a time for people. People need empathy. People need to feel like we care about their overall health. And within that, vaccination.
Absolutely. I mean, I think certainly the experience of many community organizations, advocates across the region has been almost one of being overwhelmed, looking at the impact COVID has had on exactly what you're saying, our historical inability of a public health system to meet its people at the point of need. We saw this when Gates, for example, partnered with Uber to deliver over 600,000 packages of chronic medication in a very short window, because people with chronic illnesses were simply not going to the clinic. So in addition to all of that, there's certainly a cloud of stigma that's coming in terms of getting people back into the healthcare facilities, especially traditionally difficult populations like men and boys, and getting them to engage with the health space. So thank you for that. I think this question I'd like to pose to Prof. Charles, and I guess it's particularly relevant in the context of South Africa that has almost positioned itself as a thought leader, a research leader on the continent when it comes to this work, and certainly the work that you lead at Cochrane. And Laya is asking releases. Do you think the press release war, talking about the efficacy benefits confidence in vaccines or dilutes it? And so this flurry, I mean, with every single announcement, and for better or worse, quite a few of us have been caught up in that, get the press release out. It's important, to make a statement, to have a position with every single development and every single trial result. How do you think that constantly changing news landscape impacts general vaccine confidence?
I think that's a that's a difficult one.
I was going to say, they give you the difficult ones.
You should have given that to.
So there's lots more coming.
Well, it's a catch-22 situation. In as much as we want to bring the trust is very important, obviously, and to build the trust, very often people need information, but how much of that information you need to give, we also need to weigh on that. But I think what is important is that whatever information we share out there, that people need to have confidence in the people sharing the information. Like most of the work from the Vaccine Confidence Project from Heidi Larson's group has shown, I think trust is very important. And whatever is done, we need to ensure that we gain the trust of the people. Whether putting out the information that keeps changing, and people also need to understand that the information is just people are bringing it out as it becomes available. I would take, for example, let's just keep the vaccine aside. For masks, for example, at the beginning, there was not much information about whether they will work or not. And that was the information that was out there. But as we progressed, we had better data that masks work and they can prevent. So when we pass this information and as it comes, I think that very often people with very bad intentions might want to go back and say, these people said this, now they are saying this, but I think we need to bring out the information out there. The information needs to be out there, and we need to wear it, not people put it in the language that people would understand, and reduce most of the technical and medical jargon that often this information comes out there. But I think this is a difficult question, and Heidi might be in a better position to answer this.
Absolutely. We go okay, to come to Prof. Larson, but not before I pose this question to you, Prof. Bisonge, and perhaps we can also get some reflections afterwards from Prof. Larson. This question is from Tanya Charles. People of color are mistrusting of vaccines because of a long history of Black bodies being exploited in the medical field. Does countering vaccine mistrust also include training, conscientizing, and educating the white global North medical fraternity about racism and bias so that they don't operate in racist and exploitative ways in speech and in practice? I don't hear much about these kind of interventions. Do they exist? And I think that's particularly coming off your opening comments around remarks made by the French doctors, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, a very complicated history around medical research. So what are your thoughts of, is there any existing interventions, and what do you view as the opportunities to work in solidarity with researchers and partners in the North to raise this common level of consciousness around the politics and the structural issues that impact and shape the way research is perceived in communities?
Yeah, I think this is a very pertinent issue, and I'm not sure whether I have a right answer to that. There have been a lot of things that have been done, horrible things that have been done in the past. I just mentioned the kind of remarks that these French doctors made, and they were saying that, you need to do this in Africa because nobody has masks there. It's just like testing drugs in prostitutes because they will not protect themselves. And we have had various situations, and one can cite of various things that have been done and which can make Black people begin to mistrust. So if people have done these things to us in the past, how can we trust them now? So I think we have a lot of work to do in that respect, and we have to engage the communities. I think community engagement is very important. We need to start building that trust, engage the communities, acknowledge that these things have happened in the past, and that now we are taking a different turn. These are not things that we want to happen under our watch, and let the community trust us and be able to see that it's not only about talking, that we are doing things that match what we are saying. And when we start building that level of trust, I'm sure we could be able to erase some of those pictures from the past and make Black people, especially, to be able to trust Western scientists. But I must admit that it's not an easy task, but we have to start building trust and engaging communities from the beginning, just like we're talking now about COVID-19 vaccines, even before they become available. And it's a difficult task, and people need to acknowledge that and engage the communities.
Absolutely, thanks for that. So I think, Prof. Larson, if you could give us your thoughts on those two issues. How do we deal with this flurry, this tsunami of ever-changing news, and how does that impact vaccine confidence? And then in the second instance, some comments around the politics of race and North-South relationships and the historical context in which vaccine research happens and how that has then impacted confidence, if at all.
Thanks. We definitely, uncertainty by nature is unsettling for everybody. And I think we're kind of in a time of hyper uncertainty. And it's even for as we've seen with politicians and even the scientists, every day is something a little new. Hopefully good news, but it's changing news. It's also contradictions between different authorities. I know in the UK, for instance, first it was 2 meters, and then WHO is saying, need different length for social distancing. Other countries are having, so you hear different guidance, which is also confusing. We do a lot of social media monitoring, and for a number of countries in the world, we do kind of brief updates and reports in terms of what their publics are thinking and what, from a policy point of view, is concerning. And one of the common ones that we hear across multiple settings is, this is too confusing. They just keep changing the rules. How are we ever supposed to kind of cope with this? So I think that recognizing that it's a time of uncertainty, any way we can bring in a bit of normalness, things that people are familiar with, even though we don't have a lot of familiarity, but something like starting to reintroduce basic childhood vaccines, or some really basic needs that people have, something that brings something familiar back into their otherwise, really uncertain timing and uncertainty, anything that can give a bit of confidence. But it is a global phenomenon. This is not unique to any one country. I think a lot of publics are worn, they're frustrated, they're tired of the changing rules. We're talking about pandemic fatigue, and in some cases, it's erupting into social unrest. So I think any efforts to comfort or bring some level of familiarity will be important. Is important, not will be, is now important. And as I said, that could be any really basic need. It doesn't have to be about vaccines. In terms of the politics of race and all the historical issues, and what you mentioned before, this is my new book, Stuck, and it's really it really talks about all these decades back emotions, politics, histories that not just individuals but communities have their own histories, and we can't we need to be respectful and understand that. But I absolutely endorse Charles's Professor Wissonge's statement that we do have these histories, but we, now is a huge opportunity to change those dynamics. We're not trying to delete history, but to change history. And if we can't get it right now, I think one of the things about COVID is we have a massive amount of responsibility, particularly around vaccines, but across the board. If we get this right with vaccines, it will be a huge asset to our relationship with publics more broadly. If we get it wrong, we're going to have to live with it for a while, and it's worth every effort we have now to rebuild that, including and particularly when it comes to equity and respect of all people.
Absolutely. I think that's really powerful, because it really comes down to doing right, not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us. And I think building off on that, Prof. Larson, a question from Ojang Okombeng is, what impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on vaccine acceptance worldwide as regards to vaccines for other pathologies? And do we see decreased funding for other needs, for example, HPV vaccines? In your work, have you seen this vaccine hesitancy or even denialism spill over into other areas?
Well, I think right now, actually, in terms of other vaccines, I think there's more eagerness about people trying to catch up with everything they've missed. We've got two dynamics going on. Because of the issues with access due to COVID and distancing and stressed health systems, we've had a tremendous drop of vaccine uptake. Also, just supply and delivery systems have been interrupted. So I think the more we can kind of get the vaccines to the people who want them, that's going to be crucial. So there's that end of it. But on the COVID side of it, unfortunately, you'd think with such a disabling and fatal illness, affecting the world more broadly, that there was some hope in the public health community that maybe these vaccine skeptics would finally see the value of a vaccine. Unfortunately, we've seen an amazing amplification of the anti-vaccine groups, in the sense of not just the groups, but them joining up with a lot of other groups that were not talking about vaccines at all before. And now all these alternative groups, whether it's anti-government control in terms of lockdown or masks or other issues, are all coming together, so that we're having, on the one hand, groups of people who don't have their vaccines and really want them, and others, this growing sea of everything from conspiracy to anxiety. So it's a very complicated landscape. The question is, all I can say is yes, 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 in terms of all the concerns that were stated. I think that at the same time, I know that there are efforts now, and I was just at an HPV meeting where we were going country by country in terms of the impact on the HPV program. And I think we've seen, actually, what's been interesting with flu vaccine. Just in Europe alone, we saw a 17% increase in our confidence monitoring around flu vaccine. And we've seen that in a number of countries who more typically are taking flu vaccine, that the eagerness for a flu vaccine was higher than ever. Problem was, we didn't have enough supply in a lot of settings. So that's going to be an issue with the COVID vaccine also. Timing will be everything.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a discussion that certainly us in the region have been having, and it's been particularly interesting to see and unpack what vaccine hesitancy and confidence and even denialism and the anti-vaxxer movement, how that looks and feels quite different from other parts of the world, and of course different historical contexts, etc., flavor that. But I think if I could ask you this question, and then also get Prof. Bisonge's remarks on it. Francois is asking, you mentioned the importance of listening to the public for successful engagement. In practice, how do you do that? Is there specific media? Are you talking public hearings? And by industry, what if many vaccine hesitant people do not trust industry? So if it's coming from a certain industry, whatever that might be. And then Francois' question also links up to confidence in regulators, public-private partnerships. We've had these discussions really at the forefront in South Africa in our struggle to get access agreements available, just to really get to a place where vaccine research is transparent and knowing who are the shareholders, how does the money flow, who are the power players behind this vaccine? Because of course, history tells us that the presence and the work of pharma and researchers has not always been favorable to communities. So communities approach this within that context. So what are your thoughts in terms of the low-hanging communication and engagement fruits that advocates and communities can take advantage of?
This is for Charles.
This is for your initial reaction, and then we'll move on to Prof. Songe for follow-up.
Oh, that's a lot. Well, I do understand industry distrust, and it's another thing I talk about in the book. One of the questions I get a lot in media interviews is, what is it about vaccines? Why has this health intervention that was kind of as normal as brushing your teeth, how has it become enemy number one for some people? And I think it is the fact that it's so embedded with government. It's largely produced by big business, and the World Health the World Health Organization is counting every single individual around the world who's taking vaccines every year. If you have any element of anxiety or suspicion, none of those factors are comforting. So if you have distrust in government, if you don't, have any distrust in big business, or if you have any anxieties about being counted, these are all factors that contribute to different types of anxieties and concerns about vaccines. What do we do about it? Well, I think we can't paralyze ourselves because of some of these sentiments. I think that's where I think the more local we get, the more we have, and I guess the other factor in there is this anti-elite sentiment that's been growing. And what's fascinating to me is historically, science, particularly in the Enlightenment era, was the great liberator from the religious dogma, because a lot of societies were very, religion was the defining dogma, and to get some freedom of thinking, it was science. Now I'm seeing in so much of my interviews and listening that people are feeling that science is the new dogma. If science speaks, we have to do it. Well, who is science? And what language do they speak that we can't understand? Are they making it more complicated just so we don't understand it? So it's distrust at multiple levels. So I think that how do we get over this? I think, again, it needs to be local, and that local figure, that local engagement is going to differ depending on where you are. In some places, it might be the school teacher. In some places, it might be the religious leader. In another place, it might be, the local community hospital. But I think the more local we can engage and build bottom up, the better at many levels in this current environment.
Lawson, before we move on to Prof. Bisonge, a question that Navita has posted, which ties into what you were speaking about. If you were to think of two, for example, tangible actions that advocates could take to build vaccine confidence, what would those two or the top one be? And then secondly, what kind of resources and materials have struck you as particularly helpful or innovative or thinking out of the box when it comes to speaking about vaccine confidence and how we can build that confidence at community level? So a low-hanging fruit for activists, and then in the second instance, a resource or material that has particularly stood out to you as helpful.
I think the most important thing is listening. I think having a conversation, we have one of our leads in our global mental health group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is based in Zimbabwe, Dixon Shibanda. And he started something called the Friendship Bench. And it's just the bench. And it's a place that they've sat, and it was more for mental health issues, a place where people could just talk. People could talk through and talk out some of their anxieties and concerns and issues. I think we need a friendship bench for COVID, and particularly on vaccines, but in general. I think if you wanted to start and do one thing, ask someone how they're feeling, talk to them about it, listen to it, and then to the extent that you can bring in how they're feeling and what questions they might have about vaccines, we need to understand what people are thinking and feeling right now, because that's going to inform our communication. And those are the questions and anxieties we need to address when we do have vaccines and we're ready to go out there, that we are already kind of cognizant of their issues, so they feel like we've heard them, because that's a big anxiety now. They just aren't hearing us. In terms of resources, a friendship bench, I think. Our website has some good resources. I think there's a number of different places. I think what's the best thing to do here? I mean, AVAC has some great resources. I think you need to look locally, but I really think the best resource is your ear.
Mm. Yeah.
We don't use it enough.
I definitely agree with Heidi around that.
So,
Around
Professor Tongi,
listening.
what are your reflections around this concept of how we understand community engagement? And perhaps if we could start off from the point that Nita is raising in the chat around the role of the MRC, where Cochrane is situated, in stakeholder engagement. So we know the MRC has been quite brave, certainly, in supporting the work of groups like the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, who have a record of holding the MRC to account, and the African Alliance, and specifically equipping us and supporting us in this time to, number one, not only understanding the rapidly evolving science landscape, but also providing us with resources to really practice our agency, to really understand these issues around access, around accountability, around the role of pharma, around how we can hold our governments to account, around how do we deal with the government who goes to Geneva and makes these really bold statements on access and agreements and profits, but yet at home the reality is very different. So I guess a two-part question. In the first instance, you speak to the role of Cochrane within the context of the MRC and what that role looks like in terms of supporting community engagement. And then secondly, if there was one thing that you would say advocates and civil society could do to increase vaccine confidence, what would that be?
Okay, thank you. In terms of engagement, for research, there is a whole ecosystem from when research starts, like when we are developing the vaccines. The MRC does, SAMRC does a lot of research, both in the development of vaccines and also downstream in terms of ensuring that research like effective vaccines, effective medicines, and other interventions get used by policymakers and also by communities. So there is there are various stakeholders at various levels. For various research activities that the SAMRC is involved in, there are various community advisory groups for research like the development of new vaccines at the very early stages, engaging communities, both in terms of even, it needs to start even with the recruitment of participants into the research, so engagement at that level. And as the evidence becomes available, we also have various stakeholders, both from the practitioners right up to policymakers, and the SAMRC is involved with engagement at all those levels. And take one example, and I want to link to what you said about the distrust of industry and governments. One way one could try to deal with that is that when decisions are taken about vaccinations, they shouldn't only be, it should not just be because industry has come up with an effective vaccine. This is effective, you need to take it. Or WHO at the global level has said, this vaccine is effective or this intervention effective, you need to take it. At the level of, at the national level, for example, with vaccination, we have what we call national immunization technical advisory groups, which are all inclusive, have experts from various fields, but also include people from the general public. And they are supposed to be independent of government. And they would need to give advice, all this evidence that comes from industry, from the World Health Organization, from other international organizations. They need to take that evidence, look at other local evidence, contextualize this evidence, and make recommendations to government. And if such recommendations are coming from an independent body or a body that is not directly a structure of government, I think it increases some level of trust to show that there has been an independent body, advisory body that has looked at this and is making such a recommendation. And it's not only government. I remember there was one time when about HPV vaccination, a lot of information coming from like in France, about various conspiracies against HPV vaccination. And I was chatting with somebody on a WhatsApp group. I was saying that this is not definitely false. And he says, well, I believe it because I know you are the one. But how do what do you expect the public to do? The government they don't trust. Do you want them to believe the government they don't trust or the French doctors they don't trust? So we need to be able to have the engagement, like we said, at various levels, depending on what the issue is. And even in terms of taking decisions, that there's an independent body with people that are outside government, contextualizing this evidence and then advising the government. What community advisory groups could do, Professor Larson has already talked about listening and being able also, you listen and we understand what people's concerns are. And there is no one size fit all. And then being able to tailor the intervention to the barriers, to the concerns that people have, to ensure that we don't just have one message that we think can go everywhere. You listen to the people, understand what their concerns are, and then come up with a counter narrative that corrects that myth that you can give there. I'm sure that is what I would suggest, but of course, this is something continuous. We learn as we go, and we need to use that knowledge when we get it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for those reflections. So colleagues, we have 10 minutes before the top of the hour. I have 2 more questions for Prof. Larson and 2 more questions for Prof. Wisonge, so we'll get straight into it. So Prof. Larson, would you be able, this is based on the research that the Vaccine Confidence Project is undertaking. And the question here is, do you have any data that you can currently share with us from this very interesting global research? If the attitudes towards vaccines are different across regions, can you give us a flavor how? Of course, all of this is under the assumption that you have data to share.
Yes, if you give me a minute, I'll share my screen. Just there's one slide that can sum it up. Let's see, give me a second. Or maybe you want to ask Charles.
Right, I can go into your second one if you'd like to speak through that in the meantime.
Okay, okay.
Right. The Vaccine Confidence Project was selected as one of the winners of Facebook's Research Awards on Misinformation and Polarization. We know that Facebook and WhatsApp, owned by Facebook, are critical tools for spreading misinformation on a whole variety of topics, including COVID-19 and vaccines. Some recent analysis has suggested that the company is far from doing as much as it could to limit the spread of anti-vax misinformation on the site. What pushback, if any, have you at the Vaccine Confidence Project received for accepting funding from Facebook for work on misinformation and polarization, while the company itself is being criticized for injecting adrenaline into anti-vax sentiment?
I think Facebook, I spend a lot of time with Facebook, and there is Facebook as a company, and then there is inside Facebook, the staff itself. There has been a growing team, and growing by the day team, of what they call the Health Integrity Group. And we work closely with Health Integrity and with Health Partnerships, who have a lot of relationships with all the UN bodies, including, in fact, tomorrow I'm meeting with them and WHO and UNICEF and Gavi, and we're all in. They are purposefully engaging credible partners to help them guide them to where the particular issues are. Facebook is not a media company. Facebook is a technology platform, and they because they're not a media company, there's certain things that there's a limit to what they can do in terms of going into people's. On the one hand, they're wrapped on the knuckles for getting into people's spaces. On the other hand, they're told, go and clean up the mess. It is not their mess. They are hosting it, you could say. Can say, but this is deep human emotion. And if we shut down Facebook tomorrow, this problem would not go away. But Facebook wants to do what they can. Twitter is also trying. They're not perfect, and I'm not trying to be defensive of them, but I happen to know how complicated this task is. What they are trying to do upfront, where there is overtly harmful information, they can take that down. Something that has clear harm. Drink a gallon of chlorine to cure COVID, take it down. That can kill you. But there's a lot of other the anti and the misinformation groups and the violent groups and the other one, some of it, but more in the vaccine space, they're getting very sophisticated. They're turning these things into questions. They're provoking doubt and dissent. They're putting it out in ways that are less straightforward, which makes it complicated. Where they can do more and are doing more is in the space of the amplification of risk, as I call it, where, a piece of misinformation goes out of control, viral. And that's another place where I think they are and can have an impact, is to rein it in terms of how much impact it goes out there. I have no problem working. I am actually quite happy to work with Facebook. I think if we don't work with Facebook, that's a problem. And the research award we got was very much to look across platforms at the broader environment, because people jump platforms. If Facebook starts taking down people's sites, what are they going to do? They're going to jump. We see with the US political elections, where they tag misinformation, those critics jump. They're leaving Facebook, they're going to Parler, they're going to Rumble. So if you want to move someone to another platform, start taking down what they have to say.
And like you say, it's engagement.
Yeah. I can quickly, I don't want to interrupt Charles, but I'll just quickly show you just some headline findings from our 17 country survey here. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Let's see. Well, you can see the diversity here. We don't have South Africa here, but we are doing a similar study. Now we're doing a mix of survey, plus we're doing a lot of social media listening and some in-depth interviews. We're currently doing this with 15 countries with Africa CDC, and South Africa is in that mix. It's not here, but as you can see, one of the worst countries in terms of the level of disagreement and strong disagreement with a COVID vaccine is DRC, and that's a worry. And presumably that's also related to conflict, that's related to Ebola issues, because we're working on a lot of Ebola trials there, and we're hearing lots of rumors around COVID, kind of mixed up with some of the Ebola issues and some of the similar themes we heard in the beginning of Ebola, on top of which is COVID doesn't exist. And this is all a scam, which I know has been one of the various things circulating in South Africa. But we have all of our, if anyone wants any particular information, it's all available. We're right now working on making the platform publicly available, so you can go in and click on a country and see what we're learning. But that's a huge project right now, and we're hoping to get the public dashboards up by the end of December.
Great, thanks so much for that. So I think we can go to Prof. Charles for reflections and a closing comment. I know we're 2 minutes to the hour. So what is the takeaway here, Prof. Lusonge? What is the takeaway to communities and advocates? What is the one message that you would like us to have front of mind as we go into the next undoubtedly overwhelmingly busy news-wise, research-wise month that you would like communities and advocates to have front of mind and think about?
I think we need to understand communities, engage with the communities, listen to them. And I saw one of the comments that somebody mentioned about low literacy in Africa around vaccines or science. But we probably need to listen to the communities, understand them, and try to put some of those explanations in the context of their knowledge, in the context of their cultures. For example, if somebody, well, they might not understand vaccination, but in villages, they know that they need to protect children. For example, I've seen one study, for example, which I saw some time ago from Guinea, where one mother was talking about protecting, they tie a string around the child's hand to protect him from getting killed. And maybe they buy clothes to protect this child from getting a cold, from to be protected. But if we try to explain vaccination in that sense, that it is to protect you from illnesses, just like the other things, and they understand what protection is because they use many things to protect themselves. So that is also in that sense. I'm sure if we try to understand the communities, listen to them, and explain some of these things in the context of what they know, in the context of their cultures, and in the language that they understand, I think we'll be able to have a headway. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Colleagues, it is at the top of the hour. Professor Heidi Larson is the director of the Vaccine Confidence Project, and Professor Charles Lisonge is the director of Cochrane South Africa at the South African Medical Research Council. This webinar on vaccine confidence, the arsenal to COVID-19 vaccine uptake, was brought to you by WITS RHI and AVAC with the support from PEPFAR and USAID. Prof. Lisonge, Prof. Larson, it's been an absolute pleasure engaging with you and spending an hour with you on this Wednesday. Always interesting and exciting, and we look forward to further engagements. To everyone who has taken an hour out of their busy lives to join us in this conversation today, thank you for your participation, your attendance, and this solidarity that you brought to the call this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Yeah, bye.
Yeah, bye.